How's it going, Harbor family? My name is Ryan Ingram. I'm the associate pastor here at Harbor, and I'm really excited to be here with you today as we kick off a brand new series called Finish Strong. You know, as a society, we really like to celebrate the talented, the beautiful, and the successful. We sort of idolize the powerful, the popular, and the pretty. We love to talk about the fast starter, the meteoric riser, the person who has instant success. But one of the things that is true as you examine history, even in the short term, is that the only people who are remembered over the ages are the people who finished strong. You know, I think about a guy like Peyton Manning, who we sort of idolize here in Denver sports history for the role that he played for the Denver Broncos in the Super Bowl title they recently were able to win. You know, for me, I don't know about you. You know, Tom Brady may be the GOAT, but I think Peyton Manning in his prime was better than any other quarterback. And I'll never forget the years where he would yell Omaha with a broken down body, throwing ducks all over the field, but still just destroying people because he was so intelligent and so smart. I know our defense carried us to a title. But man, remembering Peyton Manning all those years ago is fun to think about. But the reality for us and for Peyton Manning is that in his draft class, when he was drafted, he wasn't even the most heralded QB prospect that year. There was actually a guy named Ryan Leaf who everybody thought was the can't-miss prospect, the one with a cannon for an arm, the smartest QB in the room. But what really happened was that Ryan Leaf was a disaster in his personal life. He had no discipline, and there were drug issues that he faced. And he actually has, even though he was so talented, he has some of the worst statistics in NFL history. He started well, but man, he did not finish strong. He flamed out. You know, we'll always remember guys like Kobe Bryant and LeBron James in the NBA for their amazing ability and for the crazy good careers they have. But what's often forgotten, even though those guys came out of high school and had great success, is there was a guy right in the middle about 20 years ago named Darius Miles, who was just as talented as Kobe and LeBron, but who didn't have the character to match his talent. And he had a lot of personal discipline issues, and he made a lot of questionable life choices, and he faced some injuries in his career. And he didn't have anywhere near the career that Kobe and LeBron had. In fact, history will not remember him because he didn't finish well. This is really something that happens in every arena of life. We'll remember Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos for centuries because of the industries that they've built, the companies that they've built. But we'll forget guys like, and you probably don't even know this name, a guy like Tony Hsieh, who founded a billion-dollar company called Zappos, but died last year from a drug overdose and just had some bizarre characteristics. And the sad thing is we even see this in the church. Billy Graham will be remembered for the rest of history because he was a faithful pastor and evangelist who finished strong. He ran his race well. But over the past 20, 30 years, we've seen people heralded and celebrated in culture. Leaders in Christian ministry, people like Ted Haggard and Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and even recently Carl Lentz, people who've had huge ministries and massive success, but whose character didn't match their competency, whose influence outpaced their personal discipline. And so they didn't finish strong, and the annals of history won't remember them. And the reality for all of us, as we look at these professional athletes, pastors, and leaders of business, is that we want to finish strong, but we often settle for less than God's best. We want to do what's right, but we often end up sidetracked. And it happens because of a variety of issues. Things like, even as we look at these people, wounds from our past, personal discipline issues, external circumstances and peer pressure, the pressures of living in the society that we live in. Sin and dysfunction and addiction can often distract us from finishing strong and from God's best for our lives. And the reality is for us today that this isn't a new challenge. We all have the desire to finish strong, but we all have a tendency to settle for less than what God has called us to. And if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to look at a group of people who are facing similar pressures that we face, similar issues that we deal with. And we don't know a lot about who wrote Hebrews or even who they were specifically writing to. What we do know is that this book was written to a group of people who were facing a temptation to settle. They had started well, they were following Jesus, but they lived in a society, in a culture where there was a real cost to following him. Where following Jesus meant that you would suffer economic and social and all sorts of pain and loss due to your relationship with Jesus. And so the writer of Hebrews writes this letter, and it pretty much details, the first 10 chapters detail all the ways that Jesus is better than any other alternative, how he is the way, the truth, and the life. And walking away from him means walking away from all that is good, all that is best for us. That walking with him is the way to finish strong. And then it transitions in Hebrews chapter 11 to talk about all of the Old Testament heroes of faith who ran their race well, who finished life strongly, who didn't settle, who didn't flame out. And in Hebrews chapter 12, we come to the two verses that are going to be the basis for this series, that we would be brave enough to start and strong enough to finish. And in verse 1 of chapter 12, it says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated next to the right hand of God, the throne of God." I love those verses. If we are going to finish strong, it will be because we have lived out what's written here. As we've built our lives on the example of the heroes of faith that have gone before us, those who have ran their race well. And today we're going to look at the first part of that first verse. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us do two things. Let us lay aside every weight, and let us lay aside the sin which clings so closely, so that we can finish strong, so that we can run with endurance the race that is set before us." And I find that we sort of intuitively get this, right? If we're going to run a race with endurance, then we have to strip ourselves of anything that would hinder us. I just spent a week with my family, and I have a brother-in-law who's a world-class distance runner. And it's so funny to me watching him do his daily runs and stay in shape and really seek after the goal that he has to run in the Olympics, how he lives his life and how he carries himself. First of all, he's the skinniest. I mean, he's in better shape than any of us could hope to be, but he is the skinniest dude I have ever seen. There is not an extra pound of fat or muscle on his body. I mean, he's rail thin. And when he goes out for a run, he will wear the lightest shoes and the shortest shorts with like this see-through jersey because he doesn't want anything to hinder him. I mean, like, I'm embarrassed for him. His shorts are so short. But he has recognized this truth that if you want to finish strong, you have to get rid of anything that will hinder you. And while we get this, I think, in theory, the way that we live our lives is often the opposite of this. It's a Thursday morning when we're recording this, and this morning we had our men's Bible study. One of the things that we were talking about, human nature, we just think that we can do one more thing. We love to add things to our plate. We're the people of more and better and longer and faster. And so we're always adding obligations at work and activities for our kids and people to hang out with and stuff to do and plans to cram on our calendar. And if we're not careful, we end up burdening ourselves so much with often good things that we end up crashing and burning. And we look at the lives of the people who didn't finish strong that we mentioned at the beginning of this message. So often we ignore the issues in our life and we don't take care of the things that weigh us down, the sinful addictions and the things in our past. And again, we end up, if we're not careful, falling apart. We must be intentional. And if we're not going to settle, we have to go all in, like my brother-in-law has with his goal to be a world-class distance runner. And the best analogy that I can think of as I look at these two things, laying aside every weight and then laying aside the sin which clings so closely, as I look at the examples of the Old Testament heroes of faith, people like Abraham and Moses and Joshua and Gideon and Joseph and so many of these great men and women, is this idea of burning the ships. If we are going to finish strong, if we're going to see God's best in our lives, we will burn the ships. The opposite of settling for less than God's best is going all in by burning the ships. And this analogy of burning the ships comes from the 1500s. A guy named Cortez was bent, his sole mission in life was to seek the treasure that the Aztecs had in South America. So he gathered a group of about 500 men, put them on ships, traveled from Europe to South America, and he was on the shores of this country, so close to the wealth that he wanted to access, and his men were reluctant to go on shore because, you see, to go on shore would require them to leave the comfort of their ship. It would require them to run away from what was in the past. It would require them to strip off everything that was comfortable and known to them and to head into an unknown land where they would face disease and death and enemies for the sake of this treasure. And so Cortez did something interesting. He went all in on his mission. He burned his ships and he told his men that if they were going to go back to Europe, it would be on the ships of their enemies with the treasure that they had, that there was no other option, that there was no turning back. And I think this is really what's at the core of what the writer here is talking about. If we're going to finish strong, we will go all in. We will burn the ships. And I see three things that are necessary here as we think about doing this. The first, and we're going to use this passage, but also the example of these Old Testament heroes. The first thing that I think is necessary is that we have to make peace with our past. We have to make peace with what has come before us. We have to strain towards what's ahead of us rather than looking at what's behind us. It's why Cortez had to burn the ships. And I think about this idea of weights. So often the things that weigh us down are the undealt with things in our life, the things that we haven't dealt with. I see so often in my own life and in the lives of others how childhood wounds, how past betrayals, how undealt with forgiveness turns into bitterness and becomes roadblocks in our life that hinder us from doing what God has called us to do. We have to make peace with our past if we're going to finish well, if we're going to run this race with endurance. And I think about in this list of great Old Testament heroes, one of the action steps I want you to take this week is to read in Hebrews chapter 11 about some of these great men and women of faith. But one of the characters that stands out to me with this idea of making peace with your past is a man named Joseph, who we read about in Genesis, who was betrayed by his brothers, who was his father's favorite son, but whose 11 brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery. They left him for dead. He really hadn't done anything wrong other than being a really obnoxious younger brother. He was kind of arrogant and full of himself, like most brothers are. And he was sold into slavery, brought to a land named Egypt with people that he didn't know, who lived in a way that he didn't understand. He was falsely accused of assault. He was placed in prison for year after year, and eventually vindicated and brought into a position of power. But for Joseph, he spent years, really probably decades, suffering the consequences of what his brothers had done. If anyone had a right to be bitter and angry, to allow the wounds of his past to inform his present, to be so angry and confused that he was completely worthless in the moment, weighed down by everything that had happened. But what's interesting to me about Joseph is that he didn't hold what his brothers had done against him. In fact, there's a passage in Genesis chapter 41 where he's eventually brought into power. He marries a woman in Egypt, and what he names his sons is so interesting. The second son he called Ephraim. In verse 52, it says, "For God has made me fruitful in the land of affliction." This land of affliction where he didn't want to be, away from his family and everything he knew, the land of promise that God had called him to. And then if you go to the verse before, it says, Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." I've forgiven. I've let that stuff go. Everything that happened in my past I've recognized was for a reason, and I don't have to hold on to it. It doesn't need to inform my present. I'm forgetting what's behind and trying to be faithful in the moment that God has called me to. He would later, when he talked to his brothers, and his brothers, he would later meet them. They were so afraid that he was going to be angry, and he said, "You know what? God had all of those things happen for a reason. In fact, they happened so that I could rescue you And I've learned that my past isn't something I have to hold on to in anger, but it's something that God had me go through so that he could bring about his good purposes. And I think about my own life so often, the things that I struggle with, fear of rejection and an inability to say no, and so many other things are built off of oftentimes wounds from my childhood that I haven't completely dealt with. And I think about my dad when I think about this. My dad grew up with an alcoholic, abusive father who really had no relationship with him. In fact, my grandmother, his wife, when there was a point in their relationship where she was just so angry and fed up at his ways that she actually threw, if you can imagine, she was so disgusted by the way that he lived, alcoholic, abusive, angry, that she threw her wedding ring out of the house and never went and found it. She was so disgusted and angry at the way that he had treated her. If you were to meet my dad, you would never know any of this. You'd never know that he went through this. He doesn't struggle with alcoholism. He's not an angry person. He's one of the most kind-hearted, generous, faithful men that I've met. And if you hear him talk, a couple of things he says, I just live in the moment. And we had this conversation a couple weeks ago. One of the things that he says is, what I've realized in my life is that I am just so present in the moment that I often don't think about what's ahead of me or even what's behind me. And he's talked about his dad. And there was a point in time when he had to stand up and say, you know what? First of all, I forgive my dad for what he's done. And I'm letting it go. I have to move on. I don't want to be like him. So I'm going to live my life faithfully, moment by moment, day by day. This is what Joseph did. And this is what I think what it looks like to let go of the things, the weights that hinder us. We first of all have to make peace with our past. The second thing that we have to do after we make peace with our past is we have to reach the point of no return. This is the second thing that's involved in burning the ships. It's what Cortez did when he actually burned his ships. He reached the point of no return. He reached the point where he said, you know what, there's no turning back from this. Sin, the way this passage talks about sin is something that just completely tangles us and trips us up and binds us up. That's why we're called to flee from it, to run away from it, to give it no quarter in our lives because it is so destructive and so insidious. And the way we often live our lives, and I said, this is really true of me. I don't know if it's true of you, but I tend to be the person who I want to like go right up to the edge. I'm like what can I do? What can I get away with without getting in trouble? That's just my personality. I know there's probably other people like you. My wife is the exact opposite. Like if we're going to the airport or if we're trying to be somewhere, she wants to be 15 minutes early. And I'm the one more thing guy. Like I'm the guy who wants to fit in just that one more chore, that one more activity, one more phone call, one more thing on my to-do list before we leave. And I end up often getting burned. I get so close to the edge that I often get in trouble. And when we're dealing with issues in our lives, we often take this route of, I don't think it's that serious. Like, I'm just going to handle this on my own. I'm just going to put this on my own shoulders. I'm just going to handle this in private. But the scriptural response that we're supposed to take to the sin that tangles us up is to really be brutal and ruthless. We're called to reach the point of no return. And I think about in Hebrews chapter 11, the one that stands out to me is Gideon. So Gideon was from the smallest, most insignificant clan in the smallest, most insignificant tribe, and God had plans for him, and he shows up to him, and the angel of the Lord shows up to Gideon, and he calls him a mighty warrior, and he details these plans that he has for him. And the problem is that for Gideon to do what God has called him to do, he has to renounce the idolatry that exists in his family. His family was worshiping other idols. They were living in just blatant rebellious sin. And so Gideon, after he interacts with God, sets up a little private altar and worships God, in his own little area. He thinks that that's going to suffice. But then God speaks up to him. In Judges chapter 6, verse 20 says, that Lord the night said to him after he had set up his own altar, he says, I want you to take your father's bull and the second bull 7 years old, and I want you to pull down the altar of Baal that your father has. And I want you to cut down the Asherah that is beside it. And I want you to, in the place of that, this public place, really central in the city square, where everyone can see this. I want you to build me an altar. I want you to take your worship public. I want you to go past the point of no return, because here's the reality for Gideon, is that this was an offense punishable by death. In fact, the community, when they saw this, wanted to kill Gideon. But Gideon had to go public with his faith. He had to get ruthless. He had to go beyond what he was comfortable with in order to be freed from the reality of his past and his present. And I think this is so true for us. You know, the things that I've tried to handle on my own, I have completely failed at. But the times and I think back to the things that I've struggled with. You know, there was a period of time when I got to college. Man, I was a binge drinker. I got immediately involved when I got to college. Walked away from the faith that I had in high school, and I just started drinking probably 2 or 3 times a week. I'd drink throughout the week. My grades were horrible. My parents were worried about me. I almost got kicked out of the dorms. I was just a really unhappy binge drinker, and I was surrounded by friends who were a really bad influence on me. And I remember my low point was this night that my friends convinced me, and really I didn't want to do it, just to do some substances that I wasn't comfortable with. Really bad influences. I remember coming down from that and the Lord just crying out to God and saying, God, I'm so done. I don't want to live this way anymore. And what tipped it over for me, I think that moment was so key and powerful, but what had to happen for me, I couldn't play around with this stuff. I wasn't strong enough. I don't think any of us are. We aren't designed to go to the edge and to live life right there. We will get burned. And so I had to publicly just go to my friends and say, hey guys, I'm sorry, I can't. It was sort of painful and embarrassing and uncomfortable. I had to go to them and say, hey guys, I can't hang out anymore. I had to go find a new friend group. I went through a period of like 6 months where I really didn't have a lot of close friends. I didn't have a lot of people that I could rely on because I had surrounded myself with people who really weren't a great influence on me and didn't have my best interest in mind. I can think back to some of the struggles that I've had with a variety of things, and the turning point for me was always the moment where I took the drastic public step. It's why I think Jesus could say, he said, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. That's hyperbole. He's not saying we should gouge our eye out, but oftentimes we have to reach the point of no return. To get rid of the sin that entangles us, the things that weigh us down, the things that hinder us. So we make peace with our past, we reach the point of no return, and lastly, we keep our eyes on the prize. And here's the reality. You know, in this passage, and Joel will get to this in the last week, the reality is we start with making peace with the past, and we start with reaching the point of no return, but the motivation for it is actually what drives it. So really these points are kind of in reverse, because if you read this passage, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, the second half says that we are called to look to Jesus. The prize for us is what motivates us to take the previous steps. It's the call of God on our lives. It's the relationship with Him. It's the goal of life for eternity with Him in glory that motivates us to do these things. Because if we try to do it in and of our own strength, in and of our own power, without the future in mind, we will ultimately fail. We have to keep our eyes on the prize. We have to hear the voice of God. We have to walk intimately with Him. And the thing that stands out to me, the person who is most prominent in Hebrews chapter 11 is Abraham, the father of the Jews, the one who was called by God. But there's this interesting passage right before we find out about Abraham in Genesis chapter 11. And it's about Abraham's father, Terah. It says, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of his other son Haran, his grandson, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. So Terah had the intentions of going into Canaan, the land that God had promised to the Jews. But something interesting happens. It says when they came to Haran, they settled there. So good intentions from Terah, but he failed. He settled for less than God's best. He didn't finish strong. He died in Haran. It was Abraham who would go on to heed the call of God and reach the land that God had promised him. And I wonder about that. What was the difference? I think the difference was one had good intentions, one had heard the voice of God. One wanted something, but one had been promised something. And if we are going to complete this, if we're going to finish our life strong, it will be because we have walked intimately with Jesus. We've fixed our eyes on him. We've heard his voice. We know who he has called us to be. This was the key for Cortez. He knew what the goal was. He knew what the prize was. And so he worked backwards from there to figure out the steps necessary to reach that point. And if we haven't walked with Jesus, if we haven't recognized the truth of the gospel, we'll never be able to walk this out. You can't make peace with your past if you don't understand that Jesus has seen everything that you have ever done and will do, and has loved you and died for you and accepted you by faith in spite of it. You'll never be able to forgive those who've wronged you, making peace with your past, if you don't understand that Jesus has forgiven you for everything that you've done. And likewise, you won't be able to walk away from the sin that entangles you. You won't be able to reach the point of no return if you don't see the cost that Jesus paid, what he left behind, the glory and splendor of heaven with his Father, so that he could die in your place. You will not be able to sacrifice the things that are necessary to finish strong. You will settle for less than God's best if your eyes aren't fixed on the prize. This is what Abraham had more than anything, is faith to believe that God is who he says he is and that he would do what he says he would do. Faith is the substance in Hebrews 11 of things hoped for, the evidence of things not yet seen. And I think about where we're at Harbor today. Man, there are so many stories of God's provision that I've seen in the last year. I know that we've been around for 5 years. I missed the first 4. I've only been here for about a year and a half. And I'm just blown away, even in the last year and a half, of what I have seen God do. And I think back to the moment that Joel has recounted when he had the opportunity, man, when Harbor was starting and he was trying to figure out what to do for his family. And he had a job opportunity in Texas, guaranteed income, while this place was really struggling along. And there was a point where Joel had to make peace with the past. He had to reach the point of no return. He called Texas before he knew what this place was going to look like, before he knew he'd be where we're at today. And he had to decline that job in Texas because he sensed God's call. He knew who was in charge of his life. He knew where God was leading him. His eyes were kept on the prize, and he knew that he had to take a step of faith. And I'm so thankful Joel didn't settle for less than God's best. I'm so thankful that he took that step of faith. I see the same thing in my own life. Coming here, man, we were in a great church in Arizona, but we also could sense God's leading. We knew that he was calling us somewhere else. And coming here was scary. I mean, Joel seems like a great guy, and Jordan seems really nice, but you never know what you're getting into behind the scenes. But we had prayed, and we trusted that the Lord was leading us in a great direction. And can I tell you, man, that Harbor is what God has for us now. That this is where we're supposed to be. When we keep our eyes on the prize, it enables us to trust that God is leading us in such a way where we can make peace with the past and reach the point of no return, so we can finish strong and live into all that he has for us. And so as we close, then how do we make this really practical and tangible for our lives this week? You may not be at a critical life juncture like that. Maybe you're not dealing with some pivotal sin that you need to walk away from and renounce. What are the things that we can do this week? Maybe some of you are, though. I think the first thing that I would encourage you to do as we talk about finishing strong is to read Hebrews 11. Because in that chapter, we see what it looks like to walk with faith, to finish life well, to run our race with endurance. So would you read this week, Hebrews 11? Maybe take it, it's not a long chapter, read it every day. Or pick pieces of it and read that portion. Or go back and read about some of the characters in the Old Testament that it talks about. The second thing I think that we have to do alongside this, what are the action steps? We have to trust that God has our best in mind. We have to trust that God knows what we need better than we do. You know, Joel has a great phrase. As we were talking about this message, the phrase that he mentioned, and I'm sure you've heard him say this, you know, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds my future. God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his glory, even when we don't understand in the moment. And we can trust that based on what we see in those Old Testament heroes and here in Hebrews 12. So would you do that? And then the third thing that I would encourage you lastly is that we would, as we look at reaching the point of no return, that we would go tangible, that we would go public, and we would go large in what God has called us to do. That we would go tangible, public, and large. We see this all throughout. God doesn't look for just the private acts of obedience. He looks for the public, the tangible, the magnanimous. It's really sort of the breaking point in every one of these stories. Abraham had to leave his family. Joseph had to forgive his brothers. Gideon had to tear down the altars. Story by story, we can see this present. In our own lives, as we walk away from the weight that hinders and the sin that entangles, we can see this work out. And I think about, next week, we're going to have a pig roast in person. We're going to celebrate baptism. Baptism is an example of going tangible, public, and large. You through a public identification in a tank of water or in a lake, depending on where you're at in the world, you identify yourself in a tangible way as a follower of Jesus. And this has real consequences. It's sort of a turning point that we can all look at where God has. It's not what saves us. Faith is what saves us, but it's the moment we look back to as we begin our faith in Jesus where things change. What's the tangible, public, and large thing that you can do this week as you seek to strip off everything that tangles and hinders you so that you can finish strong? And I love you, Harbor family. I hope that you will truly engage in not just this series, as we talk about finishing strong, not just Hebrews 11 and chapter 12, but in this moment, as we wrap up this service in worship. Here's my hope. I'm going to pray. And my hope is that as I pray, you will really seek the Lord. As we worship in these final moments, that you will seek after the Father, and that he will really speak into you, impress onto you what it is that you are called to do this week, what your act of obedience is. What's the tangible, public, and large step you can take? How are you not trusting, believing by faith that God has your best in mind? My hope is that he'll mold us more and more into his image and speak to us clearly in this moment. Would you join me as we pray? Father, I love you, and more than loving you, I'm thankful that you love us. Jesus, that you have gone before us, and you are the champion that we build our lives upon. You are the one that we trust. When we keep our eyes on you, Lord, I thank you that we can walk away from so many of the things that hinder us, the ways that hinder us, the sin that entangles us. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be people who faithfully follow you this week. Lord, show us what it looks like to burn the ships, to go all in. Show us what it looks like to make peace with our past, to strip off every weight that hinders, to reach the point of no return, to get rid of the sin that entangles us so that we can keep our eyes on the prize and finish strong before you. I pray a blessing over the Harbor family this week. And in this moment, God, I pray that you would speak to us as we wrap up this moment in worship. Lord, I thank you for this time we get to share together. In Jesus' name, amen.